Hey, what's up, class? After talking to a few of you today about solving equations and evaluating trig expressions, I thought it might be helpful if I went through and gave you an example of each. So here I've got the key question when it comes to reciprocals. What's the difference between evaluating secant and solving an equation that involves secant? So let's first take a look at evaluating. We want to evaluate the secant of 0.743. Remember, when we evaluate trig functions, we're evaluating an angle. So our input there, 0.743, is an angle. That means this is 0.743 radians. So I go to my calculator. I don't have a secant function, but I can find the cosine. First of all, I need to make sure my calculator is in radians, which it is not. So I'm going to go to mode. I'm going to arrow down, highlight radians, and hit enter. And now I am in radians. I cannot find the secant of 0.743 radians directly, so instead I'm going to start by finding the cosine of 0.743 radians. And I get 0.7364. So the secant of 0.743 is 0.7364. I know that, that is the cosine. I know that the secant is 1 over that cosine. It is the reciprocal of cosine. So my secant is 1 over 0.7364. I go to my calculator. I take 1 over second answer, and I get 1.358. So the secant of 0.743 radians is 1.358. That's what it means to evaluate my trig function using reciprocals. Now, this other example, I'm solving an equation. Secant of what angle, or angles, is equal to 3.20. Again, let's do this in radians, and I want to give all possible answers between 0 and 2 pi. So this time I'm trying to find the angles that have this outcome for secant. Again, I need to deal with reciprocals. I don't have an inverse secant button on my calculator, so I'm going to start by saying, hey, I know that if the secant of theta is 3.20, that must mean that the cosine of theta is the reciprocal of 3.20. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what angle has a cosine of that reciprocal. I can go to my calculator. 1 divided by 3.20. And it turns out I'm looking for an angle who has a cosine of 0.3125. So what I'm really solving now is that the cosine of theta is equal to 0.3125. This time, I can use my inverse cosine function, and the calculator is going to tell me what angle in radians has a cosine of 0.3125. So my first answer is that theta is equal to 1.25 radians, which is less than pi over 2, which is about 1.57. So it's somewhere here, 1.25 radians. But remember, there's another spot on the unit circle where cosine is positive, or therefore secant is positive, and that's down in the fourth quadrant. If I go back 1.25 radians, how do I find that? I'm going to do 2 pi minus my answer, and I get 5.03 radians. So theta is also equal to 5.03 radians, which would be that angle right there. We talked about in class, how can I check that these are my correct values? I can go the other direction. If I take the cosine of 5.03 radians, I should get 0.3125. Just like if I take the cosine of 1.25 radians, I will also get 0.3125. And of course, the reciprocal of that ratio is 3.2, which was what I was solving for. So that's the difference between using reciprocals to evaluate a secant function and using reciprocals to solve an equation that has secant in it. At the end of the day, the big thing to remember is we take reciprocals of trig ratios. So when I was finding the secant of 0.743, I first found the cosine, that's my trig ratio, and then I took the reciprocal. When I was solving the theta for secant theta equals 3.20, 3.20 was my trig ratio. So I took the reciprocal of that and then used inverse cosine. We take reciprocals of trig ratios, not reciprocals of angles. Hopefully that's helpful. And if you've watched this video and paid attention and thought about the difference between these, practiced it a few times on homework, worksheets from class, My Open Math, whatever, it will pay off on tomorrow's test. Thanks for watching.